Naushad Forbes, the co-chairman of Forbes Marshall, which is India's leading steam engineering and control instrumentation firm, a former president of CII, and the chairman of the Center for Technology, Innovation and Economic Research in Pune, and most lately, the author of this book, The Struggle and the Promise, Restoring India's Potential. Mr. Forbes, welcome to ThePrint.
Thank you, Jyoti. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you. And you're in Pune. I'm in New Delhi, of course. I see the jacket of your book, big and bright at the back.
Yes, now, and it's warmer in Pune than it is in Delhi today.
Well, the heat's up in Parliament, as you know. Prime Minister Modi has made a big speech just a day or so ago, in which he has attacked the opposition for being critical of the government. And that's one of the things I wanted to talk about in your book as well, because what is interesting about your book is that, of course, there's a lot of economics and there's a lot of statistics and data and graphs. But what is interesting for me as a layperson is also how you interlink this with the politics and the culture of India. So, which is why I come back to the Prime Minister's speech in which he talks about the opposition. He refers to the Congress party, he doesn't name them, saying that they are the head of the Tukre Tukre gang and other such phrases. So your first response to that?
Well, we, right at the start of the book, the phrase that I use to describe us, and I'm not the only one who describes us that way, I describe us as a noisy democracy. And these kinds of comments are a reflection of that noisy democracy. It's not one way. It's the government will insult the opposition insults the government. These insults sometimes run at the party level, sometimes they run at the personal level when they're particularly, if you ask me, nasty. I wish they weren't there, but I think it goes with the territory of being a noisy democracy. And I, for one, would not give up the democracy part. And you might say, look, we should control this. We should not be allowed to make outlandish statements. But I think it's more important to have free speech. That free speech being used by our politicians to say things that they perhaps would not say if they thought about it more seriously and, wanted to be polite and so on. But I'm okay with it. I just see that as part of the territory of us being a noisy democracy. It makes us a really lively country. We're not alone, by the way. If you look at the US, we very often, when we would visit the US on delegations, we would, people would say, your so-and-so politician said this. And what do you think of that? And I'd say that, listen, if you take every statement that every Indian politician makes and take it seriously, right, you will do nothing in India. And I said, but frankly, if you take every statement made by an American politician, you wouldn't do anything in America either.
That's right.
That's the territory that a noisy democracy goes, that's the territory that you get with a noisy democracy. That's what you get.
I suppose, it makes you different from China, for example.
Well, totally. It's very boring.
Yeah. But it is the second largest economy in the world and very quickly catching up with the largest economy, which is the US. So to you, Mr. Forbes, how do you reconcile both these? It's a noisy democracy. You need to pull at least 350 million people out of poverty. And that's the figure that you've cited in your book. So how do you reconcile both these seemingly contradictory things?
So, there are different development approaches. One development approach is very much the Chinese approach. And, I don't want to in any way take away from what is, after all, probably the greatest achievement of progress in our times, right? Over these last 40 years, to see the transformation of China, to see the affluence that the country has gained, to see hundreds of millions of people being pulled out of poverty, to see hundreds of millions being given productive work. I'm tremendously impressed by it. I respect it hugely, right? But I don't want it here. And I don't want it here both from a preference perspective and because I do not think that kind of an approach can work in a country like ours. Why? Because we are such a diverse country. There's a quote that I use repeatedly in the book. It's a quote from the British economist Joan Robinson, which apparently she first used when she was talking to her student at the time, Amartya Sen.
Right.
And she said, whatever can be said about India, the opposite is also true. But
I think sometimes we use it. I think we sort of excuse ourselves by saying this. It's a bit of it's a statement now that's true for everything. But go ahead.
But I'll say, I don't think we should see it as an excuse. If we excuse it, if we use that as an excuse to not doing something sensible, I don't buy that, right? Because if we're not doing something sensible, we're doing something silly, right? I'm not saying use it as an excuse, but use it as a reflection of our diversity, of our pluralism. Given that diversity and pluralism, you cannot have a strong, centralized state that dictates how we should progress. You need to depend on millions and millions of entrepreneurs, millions and millions of individuals to unleash their own enterprise. And the role of the state is somewhat smaller. It needs to be indeed a minimal role. Right. It's why, by the way, I think India took off after 1991, because I think what happened in 1991 was the state stepping back in many, many areas. And the results flowed from that stepping back. It flowed from industry, but it flowed from individuals who moved to cities, got whatever jobs they could, whether in construction, whether in delivery, whether in some small restaurant somewhere, and tried to get ahead in life. And I think that's our development model. It has to depend on unleashing the wider enterprise of the population and the wider industrial sector, rather than just a few firms, rather than being state directed, rather than the state taking the call on what the right sectors are, the right things are to do.
Okay, but in a sense, the Modi government has been trying to do some of that. I mean, the sale of Air India, for example, LIC is now being put on the block, and according to some reports, another 1,500 sort of PSUs are going to be put on the block.
I think all incredibly sensible, all things that we should be doing and doing quickly. I think Air India was privatized so late that beyond a sort of pro forma objection by a few people, no one tried to defend the sale of a company that was losing 20 crores a day. Right. So, we have this very ambivalent attitude to privatization. Mm-hmm. We have this view, we must privatize the companies that are doing terribly, right? Mm-hmm. We should privatize because it makes sense to privatize. It means that those assets will be better used in the private sector. They will expand, they will invest. Take a company that was privatized. The first company I think that was ever privatized was Hindustan Zinc, right? When it was privatized, it was a small, relatively profitable, but very minorly profitable company. It was a small enterprise.
Right.
It became a hugely successful business. It set up new plants. It's expanded significantly. Isn't that what we want? We want our enterprises to really thrive and blossom and grow. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's what happens in the private sector.
And yet you say, Mr. Forbes, in your book, you talk about, very interestingly, you talk about how between 91, of course, the economic reforms were unleashed under the Narasimha Rao government. But then you go on to say that for a decade and a half, when politics was more fragmented, actually the entrepreneurial spirit or animal spirits, as Dr. Manmohan Singh famously called them, were unleashed. But then you come back to 2017 when Prime Minister Modi is firmly ensconced in power. And you say that the return to politics with one dominant party was accompanied by increased bureaucratic control, protectionism, and more state intrusiveness. And you give the example of COVID, and actually a critique of COVID is quite devastating. Mm-hmm. Of the way the state handled COVID, of course.
Yeah, very much so. I think the role of the state I don't think it was, by the way, someone being hugely wise saying we're going to step back. That's what happened, right? And because of coalition politics for many, many years, we ended up with a much more fragmented politics. And I think that fragmented politics, as I argue in the book, did create space, and it created more space for enterprise. It created more space for many individual entrepreneurs to thrive, but it also created space for much more inclusive politics, because you had the rise of many regional parties. Some of those regional parties are, how can I politely describe it, are quite venal. Right? But at the end of the day, they are still representative of particular groups of people, because that's why they succeed as parties. And I think that's all. To me, that was a reflection of the state stepping back, maybe being pushed back or whatever, and enterprise, not only enterprise thriving, but institutions thriving. Because I think because you didn't have a dominant state, then you had people like Seshan at the Election Commission of India, playing a much more dominant role, enforcing rules that chief election commissioners had not enforced for 20, 30 years.
Right.
And you see that kind of the presidency, again, gaining renewed authority in these more fragmented political times. The Supreme Courts, the Supreme Court, High Courts, also exercising their authority to a great extent. And when you have all these balancing influences of institutions, I think India thrived, I think, as a result. I think that all those things were very positive in creating conditions where we thrived.
Okay, so I understand the fragmentation of politics and how this sort of allows entrepreneurs like yourself and other people to sort of unleash the animal spirits. But why do you then you come back to 2017 and you talk about the bureaucratic control, the increased red tapeism, and then you go on, and when COVID hits and the lockdown is imposed, and you talk about how the lockdown was imposed in 4 hours, but how that sort of devastated the economy.
Exactly. I mean, I feel that the way in which we've handled COVID is a reflection of it's a reflection of the state capacity we have. I think the intentions were right. But in spite of those right intentions, the way in which the implementation flowed was a reflection of our state capacity. So you had very draconian, stringent conditions that came in at the time of the first lockdown. The state governments.
But did you need those? I can argue, or
no,
the government can argue.
I don't think we needed them. One can make the argument that there were some things that we did, by the way, which were unique in the world. For example, we stopped all logistics. All movement of non-essential goods was stopped, leaving trucks, hundreds of thousands of trucks stranded across our highways around the country. We should remember that, because no one else did that. And it took weeks to get that all restarted when we realized what had happened. No one stopped all of manufacturing. We were, again, unique as a country in doing that. We learned. But
why did we do that? Are you saying, okay, that even if the rest of the world didn't do that, but in a sense, India being such a poor country, you needed to cope. This is, like you said, a once in a century event. That's, we're still in the middle of it. I mean, well, we're still there. But so can you excuse the government for that you'd never seen anything like this before?
Well, the first lockdown, and the first wave of the pandemic, if you like, I can excuse the government because the government was flying blind as much as the rest of the world and as much as the rest of us.
Yeah.
They were doing what they thought was the best thing. In retrospect, it was not. But in retrospect, it was not. So I can sort of say, okay, they did the best they could. They took the best calls they thought they were taking at the time. Okay. Second wave, I don't think that excuse applies. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So second wave, I think we handled things very badly as a country. We could have gone much further with our vaccination program. We approved our first vaccines in January. As of May, we had vaccinated just 3% of our population. When we have the world's largest vaccine manufacturers in it, we could have gone much further if we'd vaccinated a much larger number of people, as many of us were arguing at the time. We were persistently, I remember being in a meeting with officials concerned with this at the end of February and making this argument for Pune as a city, because we could see the rise of cases. Pune was where we saw the first increase, the first substantial increase. And we said, listen, let us vaccinate our population. It will slow down the spread, not just in Pune, but it'll slow down the spread everywhere else in the country. Wasn't allowed. I'm saying, so we. But
why wasn't it allowed? Is it because there was control at the center and they didn't want to delegate?
There was control at the center. It was controlled at the center, that no particular area can go further than our overall national policy. We had all these limits. First, only healthcare workers. Then after that, only people over the age of 60. Then after that, people between the ages of 45 and 60. Then finally, we opened it up. But we opened it up finally after the second wave had run riot through the population. And the same applied with the provision of oxygen. The same applied with then, when the devastating second wave really hit. I mean, I was disappointed that when we needed the state to be most visible, it became invisible suddenly. And for about a month, you didn't really hear anything. At a time when the message was sort of, look, fend for yourself. That was not a good message at the time. So I think, I was terribly disappointed with the way in which we as a country handled the second wave. I thought it was devastating in terms of its health impact, and I thought it was devastating in terms of the image of India in the world. And frankly, we deserved the image that was presented because we did a terrible job of handling the second wave. We've done so much better in the third wave, so much better. We've learned.
Yeah. So, but Mr. Forbes, you use this word potential. In fact, the cover of your book has the phrase restoring India's potential. But my question to you is this. So what do we learn from this pandemic, for example? You talk about how the sort of the centralized control, does that give way then, and you learn from it, and therefore the third wave, which you're sort of applauding the government for. So what are the lessons that we have learned as a nation?
So I think we've learned quite a few lessons from the pandemic. I think we could have done the second wave itself better without going through that incredibly painful, traumatic experience. And this is not my work in this area. There's a book that I quote frequently through my own book, which is a book by Vijay Kelkar and Ajay Shah, and where they talk about the way in which you bring about the right kind of governance. And they say, go step by step, work transparently, work in the open. Have when you first introduce a new policy, do not have draconian punishment provisions, have very minor fines. And as you get better at the policy, at implementing that policy, then you can expand then you can make the penalties, etc., greater if you don't follow the policy. So it's a very sensible book. I believe it's a book that should be essential reading for anyone who goes into the government. I think it's a terrific book. I recommend it to everyone, by the way. It's very well written too.
But when you talk about sort of lifting 300 million people out of poverty, right?
Yeah.
And you say that's one of the things that the Chinese did, or South Korea has done, or the East Asian giants. But my question to you is that, you say that when the government does less, citizens and firms must do more. And how can this be done right? And how can this become a strategy for leadership? But the point is that sometimes the government, when, you accuse the government of being absent during the pandemic, but then you say that the government should do less. to enable people to do more?
So one of the things that I say in the book is I talk about how my own views of the government and the role of the government have changed over the years. Mm-hmm. My view of the government used to be India doesn't need better government. India needs less government. Full stop. Yeah. I've changed my view. My view has changed, and it's changed as a result of reading like Kelkar and Shah, right? In terms of saying, actually, it's not that India needs less government. It needs instead a government that does fewer things. And by focusing on those fewer things, it does them better, right? So it's not that we need less government, but we need more limited government, a government that's much more focused on just those things that only it can do. The police, criminal justice, public health, primary education. These are the things that the state really needs to worry about and focus on. And then what it should not be doing is everything else. So it should not then be trying to say, okay, we will run the entire vaccination program with no role for the private sector. Use the private sector as partners. It should not be trying to produce things itself. Rely on the private sector for producing them. It should not be trying to develop products itself. Rely on the private sector again to develop products. It should not be trying to run educational institutions. Rely again on both public and private independent institutions to operate independently. And I think that's where this issue comes up, that by the state focusing its limited capacity on only those things, the things that only it can do, right? Then that's how you do them better. And public health is very much one of those. And then other things you get out of the way and let the private sector or public institutions get on with the job independently.
So, for example, in the US, when during the pandemic, the government poured billions of dollars into companies like Pfizer and Moderna to help them sort of, collapse the research in a sense and make vaccines. And even in Russia, you saw how the government sort of put money into companies to build the vaccines, and the Chinese. So you're saying to encourage the private sector. So perhaps the government could have poured money into the private sector to do these things.
At the minimum, what it could have done was to have placed orders for vaccines, enough orders for vaccines, so that the private companies concerned knew exactly what they needed to supply and in what time frame. Those orders should have been placed on the basis that, look, we have 1.4 billion people. We have whatever it is, 950 million out of those 1.4 billion are adults. We need 950 million times 2 shots. We need 1,700 million vaccines. Yeah. Here's an order that adds up to 1,700 million. That's what we could have done in January. Mm-hmm. In January. There was no good reason why we didn't.
But the fact that you have such a huge bureaucracy, an elected government, a very powerful elected government, and you still didn't do it.
Yeah. And I don't think, again, I don't think it was a sin of commission. I think it was a sin of omission. I think it was, it was debate. Okay, here's an order for 50 million, or here's an order for 100 million. But, if we'd really applied our minds, and you have lots of people who were, by the way, writing op-ed pieces, myself included, but many others, advocating just these kinds of things. Place orders for 1,700 million doses. We could, these are things that are best left to the scientific establishment, to the medical establishment. And they should not be calls that have to be taken by someone high up in the government. These are that's my point on state capacity. Leave the more decentralized decision making is in India, the better off we can be. And this is a good example.
So perhaps that's one of the biggest lessons that India can learn from COVID. And you say while COVID came as a huge shock, it also brought an opportunity. Has brought an opportunity for a huge reset. So would you say, what are the 3 things that you cite, say, in your book that we could learn?
So, the first, by the way, is that particular paragraph really has to do with labor. So, and I'll come to that in a minute. But the first thing is, continuing what we were talking about with regard to vaccines, is this, there's an essential role for the state here, which is laying down the protocol for vaccination, right? And the state did that perfectly, right? The Prime Minister went around and visited all the manufacturers. This is in January 2021. He provides a visibility and an importance to vaccinations that is really welcome, very healthy, and by the way, not that common around the world, right? I mean, remember, January 2021 is when Trump was doing whatever he was doing in the US. It's when Boris Johnson was messing around in the UK. It's when you had Bolsonaro doing whatever he was in Brazil. We were doing a lot better, right? Without question, right? We also have at that time the government saying, okay, this is the protocol. Healthcare workers, frontline workers, over 60, over 45, etc. Very sensible. Having laid down that protocol, then let people get on with the job. Don't then say, okay, now everyone has to register on the same app. If you can't, too bad, you can't get the vaccine. Don't say that this different hospitals, or you can administer 1,000. No, we will only let you administer 300 vaccines a day. I mean, I'm not joking. This is exactly what we experienced, right? I'm on the board of a hospital. My brother's on the board of another hospital. This is what we saw happening. We were ready to administer 1,000 vaccines a day each. We were allowed to administer 300 a day. This is at the height of the second wave, right? Why? I mean, this is an example of the state where the state needed to, having laid down the right protocol, get out of the way so that people can get on with the job, right? So I think it's not an issue of the state not having a role to play. It has an essential role to play, and that's how my view has changed. But that essential role is limited. And if it recognizes that, and it works in some degree of communication and even partnership with the private sector and with NGOs, and then it says, for example, NGOs have a role, right? I mean, I'm not trying to make any argument that the private sector is this wonderful halo, haloed enterprise. Some companies are like that, but there are some that are only in it for profit, right? So you need NGOs that will act as a control on private companies as well. You need NGOs to say, listen, here's what you're doing. You're ignoring all of these people in your community. Don't you think you should play some part in vaccinating them as well? Because you won't be safe if they're not safe.
But why do you think the government didn't get out of the way? Do you think they don't trust the private sector?
No, I mean, I don't think the government. Which bureaucrat do you know that knows how to get out of the way? I mean, not just in India, anywhere in the world, right? I mean, if you leave it to bureaucrats to decide when they should step out of the way, they'll never step out of the way. It takes a very unusual bureaucrat. There have been some, the 1991 group.
But isn't that where the politicians as elected governments are supposed to come in?
That's where it's the stepping out of the way is a role for the government. It's the role for the elected representatives. And I think, by the way, this government has the necessary political will to actually try and limit the power of bureaucrats. But because there are some impulses to control something here or there, you end up then giving bureaucrats more power. And when you give bureaucrats more power, then at least in our country, in our system, you end up performing at less than potential. If we instead said, hey, listen, let's trust people. Let's go on the basis that people, there may be a few transgressors, but because of those few transgressors, we're not going to distrust the whole lot of industry, all NGOs, etc. We'll go on the basis that the great bulk of people want to do a good job. And then let's see what happens. And whenever we've done that, you've seen results.
So it was a lack of trust.
I think it's a combination of a lack of trust and maybe it's fear. Maybe it's, what will happen? People will question me, how did you let them achieve X, Y, Z? there's been this whole, if you have a particular public enterprise that takes a decision to, for example, issue a loan, they're afraid that sometime later, 10 years out, someone will come back and question them and say, on what basis did you provide this loan? Mm-hmm. Now, if you provided the loan and it ended up going bad because the enterprise failed, right? Not because it was fraudulent, but simply because it was a bad business, right? You have to simply say, that's the nature of banking. That's why banking actually involves judgment. And if it involves judgment, you will occasionally make bad
judgment. Yeah.
And if you have bad judgment, you say, I'll learn from this the next time around that I have to make, a choice. But it's not criminal activity. Going bust as a business is not a crime and shouldn't be.
So this struggle that you talk about in your book, the struggle and the promise. Now, what is the promise of India, or the potential of India, and can you learn from this horrific trauma that we've been through?
So the promise of India is just look at the response that, coming back to the pandemic again.
Yeah.
Right? Look at the response of various cities in organizing things for themselves. I mean, let me talk just about Pune, right? We have in Pune something called the Pune Platform for COVID Response, set up by Sudhir Mehta from the Maratha Chamber of Commerce. They've done an incredible job in these 2 years of setting up, arranging, for example, oxygen cylinders, arranging oxygen concentrators and oxygen plants, identifying which people, which manufacturers, where in the world, at what price, negotiating with them, even getting funding from, for example, Singapore gave us a whole bunch, like over 1,000 oxygen plants that came to Pune during the second wave. This is all a privately driven, volunteer-driven effort. That's the promise of India, right? It's it's people coming together to fix problems because of the space left by the state. And I think in many ways, if the state plays its part of setting the rules, of setting up good institutions, leaving those institutions to perform, then it needs to be involved in relatively few things. And I think if it sees its role in those terms, we can go much further and achieve the very objectives that the state wants to achieve. Mm-hmm. So, I don't fault the state on its objectives. I fault them on how they implement.
Now, I have a question on the millions of migrants who moved during the pandemic. There are various figures. Some say 50 million, some say 70 million. The question is...
10 million who didn't come back.
10 million who didn't come back. Now, the question is, these 10 million who remain at home, you've talked about, other economists have talked about how agriculture is, pays so badly. It's so unproductive. And yet there is a fear that people do not move from the farms to the cities, or, rural to urban. Now, how do you reform both agriculture and the labor market?
Well, that was the other point about that. How do we come out of the pandemic healthier?
Yeah.
And there are two parts to the story. One is a labor market story. Second is an urbanization story. Labor market story is, we have this very strange system in the country where we have a very small percentage of our total employment that is formally employed. The estimate is under 15%, right? 85% is informally employed. Urban informal employment, for example, small deliveries, small restaurants, helpers, etc., security, is the bulk even of urban employment, right? All of this informal employment has almost complete flexibility and almost no protection, right? All of the formal employment has almost complete protection and no flexibility. Right? We need to bridge the gap between the two. We need a mix of flexibility so that you can cope with changing demand, and you need some protection so that people feel secure. So that when, for example, people suddenly lost their jobs when the first lockdown happened, they're not left destitute. There is a minimum of healthcare that's provided. There's a minimum health insurance, say. There's a minimum even of unemployment insurance that's provided. There's some housing, that basic housing that's provided, and so on. So you need that minimum level of protection, it seems to be. And I think we're trying to do this now as a volunteer effort. In a group of industries have come together post the first lockdowns and exactly this issue, to say, how can we, with all of our contractors, bring about the same kind of minimum protection? Minimum degree of health insurance, minimum degree of unemployment insurance. That's the tough one. And provide that basic standard. We're trying to do it as a volunteer effort. A few dozen companies, and then the hope is that it will spread. If we do it right, contractors will want to work for companies that want to do this.
So that's an example of the labor market reform that you talk about.
Correct. Yeah, very much so. So that's one part. The other part of the story is urbanization. And I mean, this is not my field at all, but as an outsider, all I can say is that if you look at FSI regulations, floor space index regulations in our country, we have amongst the least generous FSI permits in the country, in the world. A city like Bombay is, I think, 1/10 or 1/20th what New York or Hong Kong, similarly congested cities, have as FSI rules. And if we actually can approach that in a much more open-minded way, it seems to me that we can both trigger a huge building boom, right, and create much lower cost, accessible housing, very much nearer where jobs are, so that people can then live in a much more congested way. It might make South Bombay less attractive for the residents of South Bombay. I don't think that should bother us. I think we should be concerned about creating a vibrant, good city for all residents of a city to live in.
It was some of these the statistics that you cite about catching up and sustained growth. And, you say that in 1960, for example, South Korea and India had much the same per capita GDP. In 1980, China and India had much the same per capita GDP. And actually, I'm interested in that comparison because we have sort of similar populations, India 1.4 billion, China perhaps 1.5 plus. So how do you look at our two countries, and how do you think, what do you think India can learn from China, despite the fact that we have this very hostile relationship right now?
So the first thing that I think we can learn is the importance of economic growth. And, very often you have lots of people with all the right instincts in the world. They sort of these do-good instincts where you sort of say, hey, listen, we need, economic growth is not enough. Well, let me just say, without economic growth, you can't afford to do all the things that we need as a country. We are too poor as a country to not need rapid economic growth. And rapid means 8, 9, 10% for the next 30 years, right? Once we get to China's level of per capita GDP, once we're at 5 times what we are now, right, then maybe some slowing down in the growth rate is okay. But we need 30 years of rapid economic growth, 30 years of 8, 9% economic growth. So, and that has to be seen as the goal of all of us, everyone in India. And I think it needs to be said, listen, you make the case for growth and you say that these are the things that come in the way of it. So we need a new employment contract. So that's why these labor laws that have been passed in September 2020 need to get notified. Because yes, it may be uncomfortable for some firms, it may be uncomfortable for some, even some labor unions who never trust any reform, right? But I think unless we engage with some of these areas that hold us back, right, we won't achieve our potential. So I think you do need to see the right kinds of changes in labor policy. You do need to see enterprises seeing labor-intensive manufacturing as in their interest, not just entering sunrise sectors of artificial intelligence and robotics. I mean, great sectors, but it's not going to create millions of jobs.
Two questions from there. The difference between China and India, and we started our discussion with that, is the fact that India is a noisy democracy. China isn't even a democracy. So perhaps that's one of the reasons why China is 5 times richer than India today.
No, I mean, China's richer than India because they followed policies that were open, that were integrating with the world well before India started. China started in 1978. India started down that road in 1991, right? Even in the period between 1991 and now, China has grown faster than India, right? So there is still a differential and a gap that we need to bridge, but we've grown faster than we've ever grown before in these last 30 years, right? So there are several things that we can learn. What we don't need to learn is the Chinese political system. We don't need to learn that the control of one dominant party is the way in which we can bring about sensible things. We can learn instead that, look, you need the right kinds of goals, and then you need to approach them in a different way, which is get out of the way and leave it to an enterprise. China doesn't have the same quality of entrepreneurship, if you ask me, that India has. Rely on that quality of entrepreneurship.
My last question to you, Mr. Forbes, is about culture. And you use the word in the most elastic sense that I thought was not possible to do, which is marrying business with culture, with technology and governance. How do you explain that?
Well, the reason I use culture as elastically as you don't seem to like.
No, I love it actually, but I'm just wondering how you're connecting things.
So is because, as I say in the book, I've long tried to figure out why particular policies work and why they don't. Mm-hmm. And my example that I give in the book is that if you look at technology, a very specific policy, limits on technology imports. South Korea and India passed almost the same laws. The laws have even among some of the same clauses in them around the same time, both around 1970, right? Incredibly different results. So same law, 2 different countries. Yeah. In South Korea, the government and the firms there work together to get a better deal from foreign technology providers. Mm. In India, the Indian company and the foreign company worked together to figure out how they could get the contract approved by the Indian government. Yeah, very different results. Yeah. Now you can look at it and say, "Hey, we shouldn't be. India should have done better. Indian industry should have done better." But Indian industry can do a lot of things that are better, right? But not if you say to them that, "Hey, listen, now work with the government very closely," because when you work very closely with the government, you often end up colluding with them. By the way, that's what's happened in South Korea, right? Uniformly over the years in South Korea, the president of South Korea is generally accused of corruption. Many presidents end up spending time in prison. Many presidents of the largest South Korean companies like Samsung and so on end up spending time in prison. I mean, this is not something to learn.
But would you say that the Indian government perhaps has an East India Company complex? I mean, it has been 150 years, but...
No, I don't.
Is that an excuse then?
Yeah, I think it's an excuse. I think I think instead, it's just saying, listen, let's lay down the rules. Let's leave it to institutions to set the rules under which we all operate. And then let's rely on our very diverse culture. Let's rely on us having something for everyone, right? To then result in entrepreneurship flowering. Now, one additional thing that I think relates to the culture question that you asked. I talk again and again in the book about how India's culture is inherently attractive to others.
That's right, to the world. Yeah.
That people who come here they go to a wedding in India and they want to dress up in Indian clothes. They sing Indian songs, they dance Indian dances. You go and meet the United States trade representative. He's very upset with you because we've just blocked some trade deal. But at the same time, he's conveying he wants India to succeed. You go to Iran or Bangladesh on a business delegation, and the message you get is, we want India to be here. We want you to invest here. We want you to be more active here.
What do you think that's about?
I think people see India as a benign influence in the world, as a country, as business, as a culture. They see our culture as attractive, as so attractive to them that they're keen to come and live here. So we should be open to everyone. We may think we have too many people. I would say, let's welcome anyone who wants to come here and make a success of their lives in India. And we should encourage as much of this free movement of people. Start with all our NRIs and OCIs, as we did very productively in the 90s. Let everyone come here and make their success here in India. That's what makes us different and special.
Right. So I'm going to end this conversation by saying that I love the fact that you kept a daily journal when you were CII president. So potentially you could have actually become a journalist, Mr. Forbes. But, apart from that, what I really, and you talk about how India starts with this huge advantage of being liked, and that we must not squander this advantage. But I would say to all my viewers, just going to hold the book up again, The Struggle and the Promise, Restoring India's Potential by Naushad Forbes. Do get out and buy it, or you can order it online now. It's so much easier. But thank you so much for your time, Mr. Forbes. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you for joining me on ThePrint.
Thank you very much, Jyoti. Thank you. Always a pleasure.